Hello and welcome to the Sunday Standard Newsweek Review. This week we are hosting Duma Boko, the leader of the Umbrella for Democratic Change and also for the Botswana National Front. Welcome, Mr. Boko.
Thank you very much.
We will be talking for a wide-ranging issues that will include the pandemic, politics, corruption, the judiciary, the UDC itself, and any other issues that might arise. Thank you again, Mr. Boko, and welcome. We thank you very much for having agreed to our interview.
Thank you.
Can we just kickstart the whole thing about the state of emergency? What are your general views, having seen the state of emergency now continue for more than a year?
The views that I hold are, I believe, views that are widely shared by the general populace. The state of emergency hasn't served much, if anything at all. It has resulted in wide-scale impoverishment of the people. It has resulted in runaway levels of corruption because of the over-centralization of decision-making and the award of tenders. It has basically given us a president who constitutionally has wide powers, but who now, under the state of emergency, operates in an untethered manner. He's running loose in every sector, every segment. He is the single decision maker. So it has effectively suspended any democratic decision making in the country.
But his supporters,
it hasn't helped.
His supporters would counter you by saying, what option other than the state of emergency did he really have to be able to fight this huge, totally unprecedented pandemic with all its effects across the economy and the health sectors?
It's important to descend to specifics so that we can design together a means-ends calculus. What are the means that we would have wanted to achieve in the face of this pandemic? And having determined what the means, what the goals are, we would then reason backwards and ask ourselves, what are the best means of getting there? Are the available legislative options not enough? And if they are not enough, in what manner can we augment them in order to achieve the goals that we believe are necessary to achieve? And so the Public Health Act, as it presently stands, has a wide range of powers and instruments that can be used. And even where it would have been determined that a state of emergency for a spell was required, it should have been precise in terms of what it is that would be suspended, what it is that would still operate, and we would have narrowed down considerably and cabined the powers of the president. We did not do that. And so the result is an omnibus granting of powers to a single individual, and the outcome is what we see now, the levels of corruption.
Would you, Mr. Boko, be in a position to say, has the president abused the state of emergency anyhow?
Yes, he has, in the sense that when you take over all decision making, you end up now having so centralized decision making that even the award of tenders for PPEs, for everything, lies with the office of the president. That is totally unacceptable. And so it doesn't seem to me that he needed to have gone this route. There were better options which he did not want to pursue, in my view.
And going down to specifics, COVID continues. People are overwhelmed. So is the economy. What is the UDC and also the BNF views about how COVID has been managed or how it has been mismanaged by the government this far?
Look, when the pandemic first hit, the reaction from everybody was one of fear, confusion, and perhaps to an extent it would have been understandable that in that commotion people would have thought a state of emergency was necessary. And it took place for a period of, the initial period was 6 months.
Yes.
In that period of 6 months, we ought to have figured out how we are going to vaccinate our people, because that is absolutely necessary. And it was always understood that the only thing that would get us out of this problem was a large-scale rollout of vaccines to the general population. And it seems we were lax. We didn't quite begin in the manner we should have. And also, you know, the systemic challenges that are faced in relation to the acquisition of vaccines. If you look at the level of vaccination across Africa right now, curiously, the country that has vaccinated the most is Zimbabwe, with roughly about slightly over 3% of the population. Botswana, it was about 2.9 just recently, and the rest of the countries are much lower down the scales. So even that would flatter to deceive, because if you look at the levels of how many people have been vaccinated, you realize that it's a very, very low number. So we needed to have prepared ourselves to roll out on a large scale a vaccination program, and that we still have to do.
And at least looking at what the situation has been in Europe, in America, and in other countries, only fully vaccinated population will be able to emerge from the pandemic. So what are Botswana's chances, especially on the economic side, when the rollout has been such sloppy exercise?
Look, the future economically looks very bleak. It looks very bleak because somebody was giving me stats saying in Mogoditsani, the people who were being vaccinated, they were saying, and there was one center, basically 32 people per day. 32. And if we are rolling out at that scale, 32 people per day, look at how many years we would need to have covered the entire population of Mogoditsani. I'm not talking about the rest of the country, just Mogoditsani.
Yeah.
We're looking at not less than 3 years. And so we don't have the luxury of waiting 3 years. We need to get this economy ticking as soon as possible. So we need to establish a coordinated, properly structured rollout of vaccines in the country and to acquire the vaccines. So I'm not sure what the president keeps addressing press conferences to say, really, when you're not talking about life-saving programs of rolling out vaccines. And this is the challenge that we face. Has the state of emergency helped us in this regard? No, it has not. And this is what it should, if anything, have achieved. It hasn't. Has it enabled the president, for instance, to mobilize resources to apply to rescue companies that are in dire straits because of the state of emergency? No. Has he deployed any programs to rescue small to medium enterprises and the informal sector, which is now drowning in abject poverty? No. And so examples keep popping up at every twist and turn, evidencing the monumental failure of our response to the pandemic, even with the state of emergency in place.
Yes. The pandemic notwithstanding, can we maybe move to the general management of the economy under President Masisi? What is your general views, especially also looking at number one, citizen economic empowerment, yes. Number two, you would also imagine the narrowing of the divisions between the rich and the poor?
Look, a president who comes in facing the kind of economic inequalities that characterize this country, facing the marginalization of the citizens of this country. They don't operate in the mainstream. They are at the margins, in the underbelly of the economy. They are catching hell. And so the starting point for a president who comes in facing these grim realities is to try and deploy programs that would empower the citizenry. And there's a very quick response that the government could have deployed. And that relates to citizen economic empowerment. The biggest player in the Botswana economy is government. Government is the biggest procurer. And government can, using its purchasing power, unbundle most of the projects that it rolls out and spread them as widely as possible among indigenous citizen companies and contractors. And so the billions that have been given, for instance, to the Chinese companies of Zentai and Unique, China Jiangsu, China State, should have been unbundled and brought on board most, if not all, of the citizen construction companies in this country. That would have spread the benefits of the government's economic power and presence in the economy as widely as possible. And so we have this challenge that this has not happened. We also have this strange phenomenon of, in the face of a pandemic that is not ebbing, you raise taxes, you increase the VAT, you now want to effectively, if I may put it in very grim illustration, you want to strip an already naked person. You want to strip a citizen who's already in the nude because they don't have any means of survival. And so when you raise the VAT, you're trying effectively to draw blood from a stone. It's unprecedented. It is totally unacceptable. It is a deliberate act of impoverishment, further impoverishment of a people that is wallowing in poverty. So these are some of the reactions. And so we would have, if anything, reduced the tax from 12 to 10% as a temporary measure during the height of this pandemic. And we would have, on the other side, because government must raise revenues, would have increased the corporate tax from the current 22% to 30%. It's not a huge increase, but it is one that taxes those who are able to, those who can, in order to ensure that the government coffers don't run dry, but also to ensure that you don't impoverish the already poor people. And so this is the problem. Citizen economic empowerment must be placed front and center of every intervention. And it is something that we need to regulate by law, not just policy, not just platitudes. And so far, this hasn't happened.
Yeah, prior to elections, I think it was part of the ruling party manifesto that they would come up with a law to at least empower the word used at the time was indigenous citizens. Yeah. It would seem to me that that is no longer a part of their vocabulary anymore.
It doesn't seem to be,
yes.
which is a pity, because that is what would be needed to address the problems of the imbalance of this economy. And so it is absolutely essential. It is also absolutely essential to try and reduce the levels of corruption and wastage in the economy.
Yes, I was going to say, and can we then move to the issues like you raised of corruption? But first, before you talk about corruption, its effects, or how the perception is today, let's talk about the DCEC, the Directorate on Corruption and Economic Crime. What is your general view, how it is being managed, how it is being mismanaged, the structure, and also the law establishing the thing, how it could be changed to improve it?
The problem with the DCEC is both structural and also systemic. The Director General is appointed by the President, and the President acts on his own advice. Doesn't take anybody's views into account. It's not necessary. And he appoints the Director General on such terms as he, the President, deems fit. And these terms are never disclosed to the public. What are the terms of the appointment of the Director General? So there's no transparency in relation to an entity that must be as transparent, as accountable as possible. So it is undermined from the beginning by the fact of the lack of transparency around the terms of the appointment of its Director General. That is the first thing. The second is that the institution itself now is in a situation where most of its, if not all, its employees, its operatives, are under the general supervision of the Directorate of Public Service Management. The Office of the President is the one that deploys and can transfer, as we saw recently when 4 of the officers of DCEC arrived at work to be met by letters transferring them. We saw a situation where the one of the prosecutors at the Directorate of Public Prosecutions was deployed at the DCEC without even the knowledge and consultation of the Director General. And so you have this very anomalous situation that undermines the DCEC. And so the DCEC itself now faces a situation where in its investigations it is hampered systemically, hampered in terms of resource allocation, and hampered in terms of the deployment of its own officers. Some of them have already left, who were investigating some high-profile individuals within government. The 2 of the ones that were, of the 4 that were threatened with transfer recently, are involved in the investigation of the acting PSP. And so the effect of this is those who remain, those who are not threatened with any transfer, looking at what transpired in relation to their 2 colleagues, will then say, it seems that if you investigate certain individuals in government, you are at risk of being redeployed, removed from the DCEC. And so the best way to protect, to have some measure of comfort and security in your tenure as a DCEC officer, is to avoid some of these investigations. So it has had a chilling effect on the DCEC. So the DCEC is an ineffective institution in relation to fighting corruption. And the other problem is, corruption has become institutionalized in Botswana. And so DCEC can only do so much, even if it were.
And so where lies the solution there?
The solution lies in a wholesale reform of the DCEC to make it truly and wholly independent, make its operatives competent professionals. Just the very concept that the Australians had in mind from the beginning when they participated and assisted in the setting up of DCEC. DCEC was going to have forensic experts, forensic auditors, forensic, all sorts of forensic medical practitioners. In every sector, they would have very experienced, cutting-edge personnel that would ensure that their investigations are done independently and competently. That has not taken place.
Yes, and that notwithstanding, we all know that Transparency International has consistently said Botswana remains one of the least corrupt countries in Africa, at least. What is your view, at least from the time that President Masisi took over up to now? Has that perception, would even how, especially of your party, changed?
Well, let me deal with the Transparency International first.
Yes.
Because Transparency International does not measure actual levels of corruption. Transparency International deals with what it calls perceptions. So what is the perception? That's what they measure.
Yeah.
They're not saying this is the level of corruption we've established. They're saying this is how people perceive this particular country. And so when you go around and you talk to people about corruption, they may not quite appreciate what you're talking about, because they do not make the link between the lack of proper medical facilities with the fact that money has been stolen somewhere. And so if you want to deal with corruption in a direct manner, you've got to link it to service provision and establish accurately what would have happened if these staggering amounts of money had not been stolen. And if you represent it to the populace in that manner, their perceptions would obviously change. So I do not want to place any reliance on the Transparency International. I think, first, they are so detached from the crash and tumble of what happens here. And having said that, corruption under the current regime has risen astronomically. And it has risen with the full involvement of the president himself. How is it not corruption? How can it reasonably not be corrupt to have a president participate in a bidding process for a farm with the ordinary citizenry? The adjudicators of that process are public servants falling under his government, looking up to his government for their promotions and their daily operations. And so, is it imaginable that they could reject the president's bid? Of course not. And if it is not corruption, then nothing else should ever be considered corruption. So these are some of the things that happen. And when you normalize these things, and you make it seem to the public that it is okay, then you have a serious problem if you are trying to deal with corruption. Singapore was able to deal with corruption decisively because what they did was, if corruption was alleged or suspected in relation to any high-ranking government official, they would investigate thoroughly and they would deal with that individual ruthlessly. And that's how they managed. Here, it's the opposite. The higher-ups, no investigation, nothing. Those lower down the rank, those are the ones in relation to whom you can become as brutal as you want. It's totally unacceptable.
Let's move now to the judiciary, Mr. Boko. We have, as a country, been talked of having a very independent judiciary, no meddling. Has that remained so?
Well, no. Maybe there was a time when people were not interacting as closely as we are now with the judiciary, when they thought the judiciary was independent. And every judge carries some baggage. Every judge, every single one of them. And so one of the most critical requirements in the establishment of an independent judiciary is an open and transparent process for the assessment of those who want to hold judicial office. And so when you've not done this, and you have individuals whom you've not quite rigorously examined before they assumed those roles, then it is difficult to deal with them once they are there. Their affinities, their leanings, their associations in the general public have never been tested, and they are not known. So we have this problem. And also, the problem that we face in this country is we have some of the best legal brains in society. Yeah. Do we have those brains on the bench? The answer is no. Why? We need to find out why we are unable to attract them to the bench. What is it that prevents them?
What's your opinion? What's your view on that? What's the answer?
I think the process is itself limits, it closes out talent. It closes out talent because they are looking for somebody who is obscure, somebody who is unknown, and somebody who privately is a sympathizer or a card-carrying member of the ruling party. This is the problem. And so if we went to the bench right now and asked those guys who sit there, you will be shocked to find how they behave and what they do, what political leanings. And it is these that they bring to bear. Take the most recent and painful example of the election petitions, the selection, the empaneling of a bench. You ask, and we're not saying the Chief Justice should not empanel. No, he can't. He has the power to do so by law. But we say, what are the objective factors that commended this particular judge and not the others to you for appointment to this panel? What is it that we're looking for?
Can we be more specific? Are you implying that it is the executive again here that is behind the scenes manipulating the judiciary?
I believe so. I believe so. And I'll tell you why. You have, see, the Chief Justice is appointed by the President. You ask, was he the best that there was, even among his peers? Was he? Was he the most senior? Was he the best performing? What is it? And if we were able to be favored with an open and transparent process, maybe these questions would have been answered and settled. Now they still linger on because they have not been dealt with. So he's appointed, but he's the choice of the President. On what basis, we don't know. So he now comes in beholden to somebody who may have parachuted him ahead of others who were more deserving. And so when you are in that situation, you are compromised already. And so when it comes to a point where you must return the favor to the one that appointed you, who's in the executive, he's facing a threat of being unseated if the outcome of an election petition goes against him. You obviously must lean somewhere. And so to avoid all this, let us have an objective, open, transparent appointment process or an empanelment process that says, we look for experience. You must be a judge of this caliber. You must have so many years. You must have dealt with a variety of cases. Because seniority counts for something in the legal profession. That's why some are advocates, some are something else. And even advocates, they are senior and junior advocates. So if this doesn't matter, and there are other unstated criteria that are then applied which we do not know, then we have a problem.
So if UDC, for example, were to come into power tomorrow, what would be some of the most salient changes that you would put to bear on the judiciary? Talking about appointments, of course, but I'm talking here of the structure, Court of Appeal, High Court, magistrates. What are the big issues there that you think?
The big issues now are that there's I think in South Africa there was something they called broederbond. There's a brotherhood. There's some overbearing control of the institutions by either an individual or one or two people in therein. The Court of Appeal itself needs, if it were up to me, I would bring in new faces entirely and remove the entire lot that sits there now. That would be a radical departure from what is. But more realistically, what the UDC will do is to institute, to bring into existence a constitutional court, something higher. You know, there was something called the Privy Council, where you had a High Court, Court of Appeal, and where people were aggrieved, certain matters would automatically go to the Privy Council. Yes. It was the highest level. The UDC would like to have that, some semblance of that, and have a court up there, above the Court of Appeal, where you can then deploy the very best, because you cannot reform, you'd have to remove these judges, and what excuse do you have other than to impeach them, and that may not work. So you need to try and engraft into this dysfunctional arrangement something that might hold it, and then count on attrition to remove those individuals lower down, and then try and replace them in a more open and transparent process. Openness and transparency in the appointment, in the promotion. There's no need to hide anything. South Africa does it. Other jurisdictions, in the United States, when they appoint you a judge of the Supreme Court, they will go and look at anything and everything that you've ever written. Even your thesis at law school, they'll bring it, any article you've published, they'll put it here, and they'll quiz you on everything because they want to understand the kind of intellectual you are, your jurisprudence, what it is that you bring to the bench. Here, we just bring people. We don't know who they are. We don't know what they bring. A guy rocks up and he's a judge, and you wonder, this one? You know? So these are the challenges.
Can you go back briefly and look at your manifesto prior to the last general elections? With hindsight now, But also with the pandemic, which by far has been the biggest disruptor, what would you have changed, especially looking at the issue of minimum wage and the like?
I think I've said before, I think I maintain this position. Looking at that manifesto, it was prophetic. It was prophetic because it seemed to somehow envision that we would get to a point where it becomes absolutely necessary. You can't run away from it. That children must now learn on electronic platforms. Mm-hmm. It is absolute. Now we have no choice. We are now forced by pressure of calamity to go a route that we should have gone. And by the way, this government, without acknowledging that they are copying from that manifesto, have presently floated a tender. I know they are going to be, there's corruption around that tender as well, as always. They have floated a tender in which they want the supply of tablets to all the learners in government schools across the country. That's about, I think, 56,000 or so learners and teachers. Exactly what the UDC said. Now it's being done quietly, because if they say it out publicly, it would become clear that they are now drawing.
No, but still there's nothing. You should be proud, isn't it?
You see, so we say, this is our manifesto. Do it. We had wanted it done, not for ourselves, but for the learners and for the education system in the country. The 1,500 Pula old age, when you have people sitting at home, unable to work, and they still have to maintain their parents, if you had applied this, and in terms of stats, 4.5% of the population fall in this age bracket, and that would be about 100,000 individuals. At 1,500 a month, that's about 150 million every year. You would have immunized entire households. The benefit would have been massive across the economy if this had been implemented. And it's not too late. It still can be. And many other things that we had proposed. So we believe that that manifesto is relevant. You see, that the issue I'm thinking about now is 2024. We just need to tweak, to update, look at the figures and look at the erosion of purchasing power and try and scale it up a little. But otherwise, the general frame of that manifesto holds for generations to come.
Before we move to talk about the umbrella for democratic change, can you just briefly tell us, in your travels across the country, especially in the countryside, what are you seeing? Any discernible perceptions of how the pandemic has impoverished people? What can you say about the living standards in the countryside?
Look, breadwinners have died. Whole families have been thrown into chaos. People are now in trauma. Small businesses have collapsed. And so there's large-scale impoverishment across the country, in addition to the trauma of the loss of loved ones and relatives. And so the impact has been massive. It has disrupted people's lives across society. And so we need to deal with this. We need to deal with this because it now results in mental health problems for many children who've lost parents, parents who've lost children who've lost. It's a whole sub-pandemic within a pandemic. And so this is what I see across, and I see a rising wave of discontent, of disgruntlement, which, if not addressed, managed, and mitigated effectively, it might result in social strife.
Yeah, but we also know that the government's hands are basically tied behind their back. Why? Because the reserves, which have always been used as a buffer, they have been diminished. We also know that the economy is not at its strongest. Yeah. So what options really does the government have other than just to smuggle its way through?
You see, we just recently had the budget delivered by Dr. Matseka that budget should have had as its main focus mitigating the problems arising from COVID. When you have projects that are running in billions and you have not reprioritized, not recalibrated your list of priorities to place, to foreground the individuals and the impact of the pandemic on them, then it seems to me you are not channeling the resources properly. So the resources that are there now, which should have been better utilized, are being wasted on projects that could be deferred while we fight the more pressing challenges. And so it seems to me that lives and livelihoods of citizens of this country must come first before anything else. And if we're not doing that, and that's what this government has failed to do, then we have a big challenge in our hands.
Let's talk about the UDC, its internal problems, which many would argue is really the big elephant in the room at the moment, and which for many would be a stumbling block going into 2024 again. Can you just briefly tell us what are the big issues inside the UDC? What are the problems between you and your deputy, the BCP's Dumelan Salishando?
Well, the UDC is a coalition, meaning it brings together different political formations, different backgrounds, different perceptions, and different ideas about how things should run. So the challenge of such a grouping is to harmonize. It's a harmonization of these disparate viewpoints and even approaches to leadership. It must bring people together to collaborate, to work together. But even in that collaboration, we need to be honest and appreciate that there's a fair bit of competition. There's competition amongst these entities that come in, and there may very well be competition among the individuals themselves who form part of these entities. And so it's not surprising. It's not something that should shock and surprise anybody. It's natural. But we also have certain agreed procedures and protocols to manage and mediate any of these conflicts if they arise. So the UDC never had any illusion that we would not face any challenges internally. No. But there's a way. And that is why the Constitution vests in the National Executive Committee all decision-making powers as we speak. So any issue that arises that requires a decision or a determination on goes to the NEC, where all these parties that form the UDC are represented equally.
But they say you don't call the meetings.
Meetings are...
Because you have the power to call meetings, and when you are supposed to call, you don't.
It's a very weak and lame excuse, in my humble view, because meetings have been held. We've been holding meetings until December of 2020, and then the pandemic. We are in the middle of this pandemic, and so the last meeting had been in December, and the agreement was that we would hold them every 3 months, unless there was anything pressing in between.
Mr. Duma, this is very important. Tell me, for example, how often do you talk to your deputy, and when did you last talk to him?
It's been a while. We talked the last time when Parliament was sitting, and that was in relation... See,
you talk about the previous Parliament?
Yes. And you can ask me, for instance, when the last time was that I spoke to anybody.
But he's your deputy. He's not anybody.
Yes. You see, deputy, the meeting point for engagement, formally, not friendship outside, I'm talking formal, is at the level of the NEC,
yes,
which is where we meet. So we have a group, WhatsApp group, where we exchange ideas because we can physically meet, and we discuss. So from time to time on that WhatsApp group, we will have a chat about this and that in relation to the UDC. And so that, I think, is more than enough for me. I don't think we need to burden comradeship or working together does not mean we must visit each other at each other's houses and no. We need to be able to meet and discuss issues as they relate to the organization, and that there's no problem at all.
Tell me what your vision for opening up the UDC to traditionally accepted democratic ways. I mean, it does not mean like holding re-elections of the president, but just saying the BNF, for example, is not going to be the sole leader of the UDC. What is your vision about that? Because it seems to be a very big problem for many people.
Yes, as I see the competition for leadership. Look, the BNF, as we speak, is the leader of the UDC. Is it intended to be a permanent feature of the UDC? Of course not. At least not formally. And so what has to happen? There are a number of views. The main views now within and around the UDC are, let's have elections for the leadership. Let us examine this suggestion for its merits and demerits and say, the first thing, and we also must be informed by experience. We had a conference, a constitutional conference, where the leadership agreed and said each party within the UDC must bring from each constituency 10 delegates to the conference.
Yes.
There was a big problem around that. A big problem raised by some who now wanted something called accreditation. What is accreditation? It seems a process by which some want to confirm whether these are truly delegates of this organization.
Because you don't trust each other.
Because there's no trust, I guess.
Yeah.
So you have a problem. And that problem means now, if you want to verify who the delegates are, you may have to go to the database of a partner party in the UDC. Is that feasible? Is that even something desirable? And in the absence of that, how do we then establish how many members you have for purposes of determining who your delegates should be? That's the one. Secondly, if we say, as we did with the Constitutional Conference, let every party bring an equal number from each constituency. And there's a perception that certain parties don't exist in other parts of the country. And when you get to the Congress there, you find a party that you thought was non-existent in one part of the country has brought a full delegation from that part.
Yeah.
How do you deal with it? What are you going to do? You open up an area of conflict right there, so that before you even get to an election, you are fighting over who should participate. And the third and more critical issue then, and I'm examining the suggestion of an elective Congress, is if we somehow, by some streak of good fortune, we overcome these insurmountable hurdles and we get to an election, and the outcome is lose. They don't in the NEC of this coalition. What then happens? That's a recipe for a split, because these parties will feel will not be involved in the decision making, and so we can't be a part of this. So those who pursue relentlessly this approach, appreciating that it could result in a split in the UDC, it seems to me, are people who want the UDC to split, because that is the logical outcome of this approach. Now, there's another approach, which is what is happening now. What is that approach? Based on the fundamental, foundational principle of the UDC, the principle of equality. We are all equal. Since we are all equal, we have an NEC here. This NEC comprises 4 representatives from each of the parties, equal. And once they sit, they then themselves determine how to distribute positions within the UDC by negotiation amongst themselves, which seems a better option than this. And if they have determined using that process, it's a democratic process, except it's not the majoritarian democracy that others are pushing for. That process has determined that the BNF is the leader. And leadership is earned, by the way. Why is the BNF the leader? I think it is the leader because it fought with everything for the UDC to come into existence. It sacrificed the most. It demonstrated the most good faith in dealing with others. And so the BNF was able to impress the other coalition partners into realizing that it could lead. And they still hold that position. If they should change and say now somebody else should, the BNF will respect that decision. But until that point is reached, the BNF will lead the coalition. And there's nothing wrong with it. So I think the argument about lack of democracy with the UDC is a very insincere argument in my humble view. I think the UDC, a coalition, is better served with this more flexible arrangement than the other one that is rigid, majoritarian, and can cause a split.
But more important, what are the chances of other oppositions that are in the fringes who have not yet joined UDC? What are the chances of going into the next elections, them being part of the UDC?
That is the most ideal, and that's what we are rigorously pursuing. We are in discussions with AP, and we are in discussions with BPF. AP is a bit of a special case because AP is part of BMD, which was in the UDC in the lead.
I'm sure they will take offense when you think they are part of BMD.
Well, they were. They are not. Let me correct that. But you're talking about people we've worked with. People who've worked with, I mean, the leader of AP and myself have worked together. And when we worked together, history will attest, there were no niggling issues, negative perceptions. There was utmost good faith. Never at any point did BMD, led by him, raise any complaints about how the UDC operated, meetings being held or not held. Everything worked clock-like because there was a synergy, there was a proper understanding and respect.
But certainly when they come now, they will put in some demands.
Of course,
yeah,
they will. And they're entitled to put those demands, and those demands will be considered, and we will agree as best we can and work out.
Which might also entail having to change the structure of UDC at the moment, because there's also BPF.
Well, there's BPF, yes. You see, of UDC, I'm not sure what people will have in mind, but UDC, to me, in its present structure, is the best vehicle for our setting. Others have suggested a pact. A pact is a loose arrangement. A loose arrangement entailing a situation where we discuss, we agree, we will allow you to run here and we will support you and we will not field a candidate against you, but it's that loose. After the elections, when we've helped you win, if you decide and the BDP comes knocking on your door and it offers you something and you say, I think I'll go with the BDP, what recourse do we have? So the pact model is fraught with potential for instability. So the UDC, the coalition that it is, which brings everybody together and binds everybody together and makes sure we proceed as one, even though we are independent, autonomous organizations within this unit, is the best. It is the best because once the UDC wins an election, there's no horse trading. There's no sitting and asking who's going to, no. It is known who the president is. And when the constitution of the country kicks in, then everything falls into place. It's a seamless process. But this one, you've seen what has happened in other countries where it takes forever to even constitute government.
Yeah,
so we don't want that.
Let's talk about your other relationship with your other deputy at Botswana National Front, which also seems to be feeding into the instability at UDC. Well, how is your relationship with Dr. Dibella so far?
It's good.
It's good.
Yes. And let us understand the relationship this way. The vice president of the BNF, in the BNF, has a specific constitutionally stipulated function, and that is policy formulation. He's the guru of policy. So the vice president of the BNF must be a very busy individual. Busy with what? With dealing with policy matters for the party and engaging with the structures of the party around policy, policy on education, policy on everything. So this is what the vice president does. And the president is the spokesperson, he's the overseer of the party. And so, do we clash in the discharge of our functions? No, because I don't interfere in his policy functions. He doesn't interfere in mine. So, but we also need to honestly acknowledge that because it's time to elect a new leadership, there obviously will be ambitions to lead. And often when you want to replace somebody, you might try and find some fault or maybe even invent faults. The better then to sell and yourself and enhance your chances. But fortunately for him and I, I've been in it since 2010. So there's a track record by which the members of the organization can gauge whether they need me or not. He also has been there. So there's no lack of information to conduct a proper assessment. So there's no need for us to be bickering. And that is why I think you've seen us focus on recruiting members.
So lately there's talk of a compromise, which will basically mean elections somehow being not compromised, but you circumventing elections one way or the other. What are the chances of that happening?
I'm not sure.
And would that also mean him retaining his position as deputy?
Well, that is also a matter to be decided by the membership. What the BNF has done, there's been a document circulated. And this document is broad. It deals with leadership. It deals with leadership at national level and at all other levels. And it tries to draw from the BNF tradition of a consensus around a leader, around a representative, even parliamentary or council. And so they are reflecting on whether this tradition can be applied to avoid the acrimony that results from primary elections, more specifically. But for the Central Committee, it is an acknowledgement that regardless of who a person is, a contest necessarily involves people coming together to support this one and as against that one. And when the contest is over, some of these sentiments then persist and they can operate to destabilize the party. Is it a good thing to avoid the instability that may result? Of course, yes. How can we avoid it? This is what the debate in the party right now is about, and it's at the Central Committee level. Once the Central Committee has settled this issue and it has shared it with the members, they will also look at it, and they will then say, we think for this position and that position and that position, this is the members will advise. And the members, when they advise, we will take heed as the leadership. I'll give you an example, an interesting example where members have overruled the Central Committee just recently without making noise. The Central Committee met and resolved that the first 100 cards, membership cards, are being offered at 1,000 pula. And the rest, 500, 200. The members have come and said, no, we will buy the first 1,000 cards, 1,000 at 1,000 pula. So it's no longer the 100. And people are coming in large numbers to buy for 1,000.
1,000, yeah.
And so and what have we done? We've said, well, this is what the membership wants, and it is for the good of the party. Let it be. So if the membership comes back in relation to the compromise thing, and they give us a compromise, we will take that compromise. And it will be the membership speaking.
And that's all we had time for. Thank you very much, Mr. Boko. For
Thank you
having
so
me.
much. Thank you.
Thank you.